I'm going back to basics once again. This time, it's a follow-up to my videos about shutter speed and aperture. It's all about ISO on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there everybody, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. If you've got a photo question that you think will help a lot of other photographers, just go to askdavidbergman.com and submit that form on the site. I just might pick your question to answer right here on a future show. If you've watched me before, you probably know about my Shoot from the Pit live concert photography workshops. The North American stadium dates have been amazing. Everyone who's come out has been learning a lot about shooting concerts, sports, and really action of any kind, and they've been producing some incredible photos with virtually unlimited access to one of the biggest tours on the planet. Now, there is still room at some of my workshops coming up in Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, so go to shootfromthepit.com for more info and to sign up today. Hope to see you out on the road sometime soon. Okay, so last month I did a video called Shutter Speed Basics because of a question sent in by a viewer. In that video, I broke down how shutter speed works and why you'd choose to change it. In the comments, Randy F. posted, "Excellent refresher for those still learning the basics. This video really clarified the properties of shutter speed. Hopefully you will do matching tutorials for aperture and even ISO. Newer photographers will love you for it. Kudos." Now, I thought that was a great idea, so the next video I did was all about aperture. I'll put links to that and the shutter speed one down in the description below. But now that leads me to the third piece of the exposure triangle, ISO. So as always, let's start with what is ISO. ISO is one of the settings in your camera that changes the exposure of your image. Now, when I say exposure, all that means is how bright or how dark your photo is. It's one of the three settings in the exposure triangle, with the other two, of course, being shutter speed and aperture. Now, those two settings are physical things that move in the camera to change how much light goes through the lens and hits the sensor. The more light that hits the sensor, the brighter the image. ISO, however, is a bit different than those two. Unlike shutter speed and aperture, ISO doesn't physically move anything. After the light is collected on the sensor, your ISO setting is then applied and the camera's processor adds a little voltage boost to brighten up the image. I think of it like post-processing, kind of like when you drag the brightness slider in Photoshop, Lightroom, or Capture One, whatever you're using. But it's higher quality than that because it happens earlier in the analog to digital conversion process. Also, the camera manufacturers made the files, so they know how to manipulate them better than anyone else. All of the other companies like Apple, Adobe, and Phase One, they make fantastic software for converting your RAW files, but they have to actually reverse engineer the files after they get their hands on each new camera. That's why your images look just a little bit different depending on which software you use. And by the way, you may have noticed that I say ISO instead of ISO. The proper pronunciation is a bit of a silly but somewhat hotly debated topic in the photo community. I used to say ISO until I read a quote on the website of the International Organization for Standardization. That's the group that develops ISO standards for hundreds of industries, including photography. On their About Us page, it says it's all in the name, because International Organization for Standardization would have different acronyms in different languages, IOS in English, OIN in French for Organisation Internationale de Normalisation. Our founders decided to give it the short form ISO. ISO is derived from the Greek isos, meaning equal. Whatever the country, whatever the language, we are always ISO. So there you go, direct from the company. We can go ahead and move on now. So the ISO numbers are actually just a holdover from the film ASA days, where 100 film was marketed for daylight and 800 was for indoors. That's because the higher the number, the more sensitive the film was to light. So the same aperture and shutter speed on 800 film would give you a brighter image than shooting the same settings on 100 film. Now, they've kept the same numbers in digital cameras today, probably just for consistency. They really don't mean too much anymore. They could rename them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but I think our heads would explode. Anyway, the concept is the same. The higher the number, the more boost is applied, and that makes your image brighter. Each number, which is double or half of the one next to it, is considered to be one-stop difference in exposure, just like we measure aperture and shutter speed. Now, most cameras are set to move in third-stop increments, so you can make more subtle changes if you want. When you go from 200 to 400, you can select 250 or 320 in the middle if you want to make a smaller adjustment than moving a whole stop at a time. Now, the technical part of photography is a give and take, and the three parts of the exposure triangle all work together using stops as a consistent measurement. So if you brighten your image one stop using your aperture and then darken it one stop with ISO, you're right back to the same exposure or brightness. So if you can adjust your exposure with aperture or shutter speed, why would you choose to change your ISO? Well, usually it's out of necessity, so your image isn't too dark. You can only open your aperture so far based on the lens you're using. If you've got a 24 to 70 millimeter f2.8 lens, the widest aperture is 2.8. If you have a 50 millimeter f1.2 lens, you can open up all the way to 1.2, but not any more than that. And with shutter speed, you can only slow it down so far before you might get motion blur because either you or your subject is moving. And if you're photographing fast-moving subjects, then you really want to keep your shutter speed even faster. Again, I did videos about both of those settings, so check the links in the description for those. But once you've maxed out your aperture and slowed down your shutter speed as slow as you want to go based on the situation you're in, you still might not have enough light to get the brightness level that you want. Your picture just might be too dark. So that's usually when you start to go ahead and push up your ISO. Now, many photographers like to keep their ISO as low as possible. Why? Well, as you start to push it up, you get what's called digital noise. Light is data for your camera. It needs light to process your image. When you push your ISO up, the amplification boosts both the signal, which is the light, and the noise, which is in the darker areas. There's less data in there, so the camera processor tries to fill in the gaps. Now, it does a very good job, but it can only do so much. If you take a picture of me in a pitch black room and the image is just a black frame, and then you boost up your ISO, the camera can't draw my face from scratch without any data to work with. It needs something to work with. Now, one of the benefits of newer and sometimes, yes, more expensive cameras is that they have better processors to work on cleaning up digital ISO noise. Every camera has a maximum ISO that you can shoot with, but honestly, I'd never use that max unless I had no other choice. The Canon R3, for example, has an ISO range from 100 all the way up to 204,800. It's noisy up there, to say the least. What I do with every new camera I get is I test them to see how the ISOs look. I determine what my highest usable ISO is. That's what I like to call it, my highest usable ISO. That's the point where I think the digital noise is still perfectly acceptable, but beyond that, it starts to get kind of nasty. I know that I can shoot with any ISO up to that number and be totally fine. Now, in my opinion, each generation of a specific model of camera gets about one stop better in its high ISO quality. I'm a Canon shooter, and the original 1DX looked really good at 3200 ISO, but 6400 was beyond where I was comfortable. When the 1DX Mark II came out, 6400 looked like 3200 did on the original 1DX. And when the 1DX Mark III came out, 12,800 looked like 3200 did on that 1DX. Now, my current cameras are the Canon R3 and R5, and while I usually shoot concerts at around 6400 ISO, I have no hesitation going to 12,800 if I need it. Now, usable ISO is subjective because it depends, first of all, on your tolerance for noise, but also on how you're planning to use the image. If you're a fine art photographer making giant, beautiful prints to hang on the wall, you probably want to keep your ISO as low as possible. But most of us are not doing that, and I think many photographers care way more about ISO noise than I believe that they should. Maybe I'm talking to some of you out there. For most of us, we're posting online, and a picture that's 3 inches wide on Instagram is going to look fine at high ISOs. It's really about the content of the image first. That's the most important thing. I made this fun shot of Luke Combs and Jameson Rogers backstage at CMA Fest a few years ago. Katie Kaus is an amazing portrait photographer in Nashville, and she created an awesome series of images with the artists and a ball pit. Make sure to check out her Instagram in the description below, by the way. I was using the Canon 1DX Mark II with a 24 to 105 f4 lens. I'm wide open at f4 and at 200th of a second because that's as slow as I wanted to go to freeze any potential action that was going to happen. Now, to get it bright enough, I had to crank up my ISO to 12,800, which is higher than I really like for that Mark II. However, no one is going to zoom in and say, oh my God, look at the noise and the shadows. The content of the image is more important than the technical part. Of course, given the choice, I'd love to make a great picture and have less noise. Katie's images from that shoot with all the light from her big studio strobes are amazing. But for me, if lowering my ISO means that I have to slow down my shutter speed too much and might introduce some motion blur, The thing is, you can fix noise if you want. 20 years ago, ISO noise looked horrible, but today it's almost like film grain, which isn't a distraction in most cases. I don't use noise reduction because I think it softens the image, but you can do that if you want to. There are new AI tools coming out all the time that actually look pretty good, so you can fix ISO noise, but you can't fix motion blur, at least not yet. Maybe AI is gonna make that happen one day too, but I'd much rather use a faster shutter speed and get a little ISO noise than risk having a blurry image. So that's really the basics of ISO. I've done advanced videos like one about native ISO and base ISO, and another about how I set my exposure for fast changing light conditions using what I jokingly call my Bergman brightness button. But there are so many creative choices you can make as a photographer, and exposure is one of the most important ones. I always recommend shooting full manual, which means you set all 3 of the exposure triangle settings. You're the photographer, and it's up to you to decide how bright or how dark your image should be. It's a human creative choice. If you let the camera pick out at least one of those settings by using program mode or aperture priority, shutter priority, or even auto ISO, then the camera's deciding the look of your image for you. Auto ISO at least lets you limit the range of what it'll choose, but the computer is still deciding how bright or how dark your image should be. And even beyond exposure, you need to just take control of all 3 of those settings. Set your aperture for depth of field, shutter speed to freeze or blur motion, and choose the best ISO to limit noise if possible. Then just go out and create something amazing. Hey, let me know down in the comments what you thought of this Back to Basics series of videos. I'm still going to cover more advanced topics, of course, but it's fun to just break things down every so often. Let me know if there's another topic you'd like me to cover either in the comments below or by submitting a new question at askdavidbergman.com. As always, I really appreciate you subscribing to the Adorama YouTube channel. If you haven't already done so, go ahead and subscribe now. Hit that bell icon so you'll get notifications when all the great photo hosts have new videos out on the channel. I'll see you back here next time with another question to answer right here on Ask David Bergman.